When the improvised explosive device was discovered in the main barracks at Camp Ironwood, the bomb disposal experts had exactly 8 minutes before 3,000 soldiers would be in lethal danger. But the person who identified the threat and saved every life on base wasn't one of the highly trained EID specialists. It was the PowerPoint instructor they'd been calling useless for 18 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock in Diana Caldwell's cramped quarters buzzed at 0445 hours, but she'd been lying awake for the past 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling tiles she'd memorized long ago. At 37, the former explosive ordnance disposal specialist moved through her morning routine with the same methodical precision that had once made her the most requested bomb technician in 3 different combat zones. Coffee black, 2 sugars. Uniform pressed until every crease could cut paper. Boots polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything in her small room look sickly and pale. But those days felt like someone else's life entirely. Now Diana served as a tactical presentation specialist, a fancy title for the person who made PowerPoint slides about safety protocols and equipment. Maintenance for soldiers who looked at her like she was their least favorite substitute teacher. The transition from defusing roadside bombs in Afghanistan to explaining proper ammunition storage procedures through bullet points and clip art had been her choice, though sometimes she wondered if it had been the right one. The memory of that last mission in Kandahar still haunted her dreams. The device that had been too sophisticated, too well hidden, and the split second of hesitation that cost her partner his life. Marcus Webb had been more than a teammate, he'd been her mentor, her friend, and the closest thing to family she'd had in the military. His last words over the radio still echoed in her mind during quiet moments. "Trust your instincts, diffuser. They're never wrong." "Morning, PowerPoint lady," came the familiar sneer from behind her as she walked toward the training facility. The nickname had stuck like superglue, delivered with just enough venom to sting, but not enough to constitute formal disrespect. Corporal Tyler Grant, a 23-year-old former college athlete who'd barely made it through basic training, thought his mediocre performance in conventional weapons training made him an expert on military readiness. Diana's face never showed the impact of these daily humiliations, though each one added another small weight to the burden she carried. To them, she was just another washed-up veteran who couldn't hack it in the real military anymore, relegated to making presentations about topics she'd once lived and breathed. They saw her as someone who'd never been tested under real pressure, never faced actual danger, never earned the right to teach them anything meaningful. The training facility buzzed with the aggressive energy of soldiers who thought they knew everything about warfare from video games and field exercises that never quite captured the chaos and terror of actual combat. Captain Brett Lawson commanded the room with the kind of swagger that only came from never having been truly tested, never having held a friend's life in trembling hands while defusing a device designed to kill as many people as possible. Lawson was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like someone who'd graduated at the top of his class from officer candidate school but had never actually deployed anywhere more dangerous than a training exercise in Georgia. His uniform was always immaculate, his confidence unwavering, and his respect for Diana's expertise non-existent. "All right, listen up," Lawson announced, his voice cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. "Today we're covering explosive device recognition and proper reporting procedures. Torres here will walk you through the basics." The way he said her name dripped with condescension, and Diana caught the eye rolls from several soldiers in the front row. She'd been demoted in their minds before she even opened her laptop. "Good morning," Diana began, clicking to her first slide, which displayed various types of improvised explosive devices. Recognizing potential threats in the field can mean the difference between completing your mission and between getting a promotion and ending up making PowerPoint presentations. For the rest of your career, interrupted Corporal Grant, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire room. The eruption of muffled laughter that followed felt like a physical slap, but Diana's expression remained perfectly neutral. As I was saying, she continued, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks, proper identification of explosive devices requires understanding their construction, typical placement patterns, and environmental factors that might affect their functionality. Captain Lawson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing an expression of barely concealed amusement. Ma'am, with all due respect, when's the last time you actually dealt with a real explosive device? This isn't a classroom exercise anymore. We need practical knowledge from people who've actually been in the field. The words hit like artillery shells, but Diana had learned long ago that showing emotion only gave them more ammunition to use against her. Instead, she quietly saved her presentation and began gathering her materials from the podium. Her hands moved with the same careful precision she'd once used to disconnect detonators from live explosives, though now she was simply packing up slides about detonator types and blast patterns. We'll continue this tomorrow, she said simply, walking toward the door with measured steps that betrayed none of the turmoil churning in her chest. Behind her, she heard Grant whisper loudly enough for the entire room to hear, maybe next time she can teach us about making really awesome slide transitions and animation effects. The laughter that followed her down the hallway felt like shrapnel, each chuckle embedding itself deeper into wounds that had never properly healed. Diana walked with her head high and her shoulders square, but inside, she felt the familiar weight of doubt and self-recrimination that had plagued her since Marcus's death. That evening, Diana sat alone in the base cafeteria, methodically eating a salad she couldn't taste while the dining hall buzzed with conversation and camaraderie that felt as distant as another planet. Groups of soldiers shared stories from their training exercises, complained about their assignments, and made plans for weekend leave. But no one invited the PowerPoint lady to join their conversations. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos from her deployment days, images from a different life when she wore the call sign diffuser and held records for successful bomb disposals that these kids couldn't even imagine. In one photo, she stood with her EOD team beside a collection of disarmed devices they'd neutralized during a single week in Helmand Province. Marcus Webb grinned beside her, his arm draped over her shoulder like a proud big brother, his expression radiating the confidence that came from knowing his partner could handle anything the enemy threw at them. Trust your instincts, diffuser. His voice echoed in her memory, crackling through the static of that terrible day when her hesitation had cost him everything. Diana closed her phone quickly, the familiar weight of guilt settling in her chest like lead dot later that night, when Camp Ironwood grew quiet and the Montana air turned crisp with the promise of winter. Diana made her way to the demolitions training range. Staff Sergeant Leo Valdez, the night equipment manager, barely looked up from his inventory reports as she signed out a basic electronics kit and some practice training devices. Can't sleep again? Valdez asked quietly. He was one of the few people on base who treated her with genuine respect, though she'd never told him why she deserved it. Just need to keep my hands busy, Diana replied, shouldering the equipment case that contained dummy explosive devices used for training purposes. The demolitions range stood empty under a blanket of stars, the training stations barely visible. In the moonlight filtering through the pine trees that surrounded Camp Ironwood, Diana moved to the advanced simulation area with practiced efficiency, setting up the training devices with the same ritual she'd performed hundreds of times in places where making a mistake meant people died. Her hands moved over the simulated bomb components with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. She traced wire patterns, identified trigger mechanisms, and mentally calculated blast radiuses with the kind of precision that others spent years trying to develop. These were skills that couldn't be taught through PowerPoint presentations or classroom lectures. They required the kind of experience that came from diffusing real devices while enemy fire rained down around you. She disarmed the first training device in 37 seconds, a time that would have impressed even the most experienced EOD instructors. The second device took 41 seconds, but only because she'd deliberately chosen a more complex route through the deactivation sequence, testing muscle memory pathways she hadn't used in 2 years. As she packed up the training equipment, Diana noticed a figure watching from the shadows near the equipment shed. Sergeant Maya Patel stepped into the moonlight, having witnessed the entire exercise from a distance that allowed her to see the fluid expertise Diana had just demonstrated. "Ma'am," Patel said quietly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been awe. "I don't know what your story is, but those techniques you just used aren't standard training procedures." Diana nodded once, slinging the equipment case over her shoulder. "Some things you learn through experience that can't be captured in a manual, Sergeant." "The way you handled those devices," Patel continued, her voice even quieter now, "that wasn't the work of someone who learned bomb disposal from textbooks. That was real expertise." For a moment, Diana considered revealing the truth about her background, about the years spent in combat zones diffusing increasingly sophisticated devices, about the lives saved and the records set. But the weight of Marcus's death and her own perceived failure held her tongue. "Everyone has skills they don't advertise, Sergeant. The key is knowing when to use them." As she walked back toward the barracks, Diana couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming to Camp Ironwood. The humiliation and dismissal were building toward something, and she was getting tired of being underestimated by people who had never faced the kind of pressure that revealed what someone was truly made of. Tomorrow would bring another day of condescending looks and PowerPoint jokes, another day of watching soldiers receive inadequate training from instructors who'd never actually diffused a real explosive device. But tonight, alone under the Montana stars, she'd reminded herself of something important. The quiet ones aren't broken or incompetent. They're just waiting patiently for the right moment to show everyone what real expertise looks like. The PowerPoint lady they mocked might seem harmless, but Diana Caldwell call sign diffuser was still very much alive beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when her skills would matter more than their opinions. The next morning brought news that made Diana's stomach tighten with a familiar knot of dread. Colonel Nathan Pierce, the base commander, had announced mandatory explosive ordnance training for all personnel in preparation for an upcoming deployment to Eastern Europe. The irony wasn't lost on Diana. She would be teaching soldiers about bomb recognition, while the very people who needed her expertise most continued to treat her like an incompetent civilian contractor. "This is our chance to show these soldiers what real EOD knowledge looks like," Captain Lawson announced to the assembled instructors, pacing in front of the conference room like a caged predator who'd never actually seen combat. "We're talking about career-defining training here. The Pentagon wants to see improved readiness scores across all explosive detection categories." Diana sat in the back of the room, officially assigned as Visual Aid Coordinator, a degrading title that essentially meant she'd be operating the projector while men with a fraction of her experience delivered lectures about subjects she'd mastered years ago. The dismissal was so systematic, so complete, that sometimes she wondered if she'd imagined her entire previous career. Corporal Grant raised his hand with the kind of smirk that had become his trademark. "Sir, will the PowerPoint lady be giving us advanced presentations on bomb disposal, or can we skip straight to learning from actual experts?" The room erupted in the kind of laughter that felt like broken glass under Diana's skin. Captain Lawson didn't even attempt to hide his grin, apparently finding the casual cruelty entertaining rather than unprofessional. Diana kept her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched beneath the conference table until her knuckles went white. "Corporal Grant," Lawson replied with obvious amusement, I think we can handle the technical instruction without too many slide transitions and animation effects. After the briefing, Diana overheard a conversation near the coffee machine that made her blood pressure spike. Captain Lawson was talking to Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the training coordinator, in voices just loud enough to ensure she could hear every word. "Look, I don't want her anywhere near the practical demonstrations," Lawson said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate casualness. "Bad enough we have to include her in the planning meetings. Last thing we need is some washed-up desk jockey trying to show off in front of actual EOD personnel." Torres nodded enthusiastically. "I'll make sure she stays in the observation area, far away from any real equipment. This training is too important to risk on someone who's never actually diffused a live device." "Exactly," Lawson agreed. "Real explosive ordnance disposal requires nerves of steel and actual field experience. PowerPoint presentations don't exactly qualify as combat training." Diana turned away before they could see her, but their words echoed in her mind for the rest of the morning. Never actually diffused a live device. If only they knew about the 247 successful disposals documented in her classified service record, including several devices so sophisticated that their disarmament had been studied by EOD schools worldwide. That afternoon, during what was supposed to be hands-on equipment familiarization, Diana found herself assigned to inventory duty, essentially functioning as a glorified equipment clerk while the real instructors demonstrated techniques they'd learned from manuals she could have written. "Hey, PowerPoint," called out Private Emma Reeves, a recent graduate from basic training, who somehow thought her 8 weeks of military experience qualified her to mock a veteran. "Can you grab us some more dummy detonators? The instructors need to show us how real soldiers handle explosive components." The emphasis on real soldiers was deliberate and cutting. Several other trainees chuckled, and Diana saw Captain Lawson watching from across the training area, making no effort to correct the disrespect. She retrieved the requested equipment without comment, but as she handed over the training detonators, she noticed they were incorrectly wired for the demonstration Lawson was planning. "Captain," Diana said quietly, approaching his position, "those detonators have been modified for advanced training scenarios. The wire configuration won't match what you're teaching for basic recognition." Lawson's response was loud enough for the entire training area to hear. "Thanks for the equipment advice, but I think those of us with actual EOD training can handle identifying training materials." Diana opened her mouth to explain that the devices had been rewired to simulate more sophisticated triggers, but Lawson cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Why don't you go check on the slide projector or something? Make sure it's ready for your next presentation." The laughter that followed was particularly cruel because it came not just from the trainees, but from other instructors who should have known better. Diana watched in silence as Lawson proceeded with his demonstration using the incorrectly configured training devices, teaching soldiers to recognize patterns that would get them killed in actual combat situations. She bit her tongue and said nothing, knowing that any attempt to correct his mistakes would only result in more humiliation and dismissal. But watching soldiers receive potentially lethal misinformation about explosive device recognition felt like a betrayal of everything Marcus Webb had died for. That evening, Diana found herself alone in the base library, researching deployment locations for the upcoming Eastern European mission. The intelligence reports painted a picture of increasingly sophisticated improvised explosive devices, including several new variants that hadn't been encountered in previous conflicts. Her experience told her that the training being provided at Camp Ironwood was woefully inadequate for the threats these soldiers would actually face. She pulled up classified reports about recent EOD incidents in the region. Her security clearance still active despite her current assignment. The devices being used by hostile forces showed levels of sophistication that would challenge even experienced bomb disposal specialists. Yet the soldiers at Camp Ironwood were being trained to recognize basic roadside bombs from a conflict that had ended years ago. Diana opened a new document and began typing a detailed analysis of the threat environment, complete with recommendations for updated training protocols and equipment modifications. She worked until nearly midnight, producing a comprehensive briefing that could potentially save dozens of lives if implemented properly. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Captain Lawson to present her analysis. His response was predictably dismissive. "Listen, Torres," he said, deliberately using her last name without rank or title. "I appreciate that you want to contribute, but threat analysis isn't really your area of expertise. We have actual intelligence specialists for that kind of work." Diana placed her carefully prepared briefing on his desk. "Sir, I believe there are significant gaps between our current training protocols and the actual threat environment these soldiers will encounter." Lawson glanced at the document without opening it. "I'm sure you put a lot of effort into this, but we're following established EAD training guidelines developed by people with real field experience." The condescension in his voice was so thick it was practically visible. Diana felt her professional composure beginning to crack for the first time in months. "Captain, with respect, the threat patterns I've identified are probably very impressive." In a PowerPoint format, Lawson interrupted, his smile sharp and cruel. "But in the real world, we need practical knowledge from people who've actually been downrange." He pushed her briefing back across the desk without reading a single page. "Thanks for the input, but I think we'll stick with training developed by actual EOD professionals." Diana stared at the rejected analysis. 18 pages of life-saving information, dismissed without consideration because of who had compiled it rather than what it contained. She thought about Marcus Webb, about the promise she'd made to ensure other soldiers received better preparation than they'd had. How could she honor that promise when no one would listen to her warnings? "Is there anything else?" Lawson asked, already turning his attention to other paperwork. Diana picked up her briefing and stood to leave. "No, sir. Nothing else." As she walked toward the door, she heard him mutter to Staff Sergeant Torres, who had just entered the office. "Some people just can't accept that their glory days are behind them." The hallway felt like a tunnel of judgment as Diana made her way back to her small office, carrying analysis that could prevent catastrophic casualties, but would never be read by the people who needed it most. She placed the briefing in her desk drawer, next to a dozen other reports and recommendations that had been similarly dismissed over the past 18 months. That night, unable to sleep, Diana found herself walking the perimeter of Camp Ironwood. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, and the stars overhead seemed to mock her with their clarity and distance. She thought about calling it quits, about requesting transfer to a desk job somewhere far from the daily humiliation and professional dismissal. But Marcus Webb's voice echoed in her memory. "Trust your instincts, diffuser. They're never wrong." Her instincts told her that something terrible was coming to Camp Ironwood, something that would require exactly the kind of expertise these people refused to acknowledge she possessed. The question was whether she'd have the courage to act when that moment arrived, or whether 18 months of systematic humiliation had finally broken her spirit completely. Tomorrow would bring more dismissive looks, more PowerPoint jokes, and more missed opportunities to properly prepare soldiers for threats they couldn't imagine. But tonight, walking alone under the vast Montana sky, Diana Caldwell made a decision that would change everything. She stopped being afraid of their opinions and started preparing for the moment when her skills would matter more than their prejudices. The decision to stop hiding from who she really was began with small changes that most people wouldn't notice. But to Diana, each one felt like a declaration of war against 18 months of enforced mediocrity. She started arriving at the training facility 30 minutes earlier, not to prepare PowerPoint presentations, but to inspect the explosive ordnance training equipment with the kind of methodical precision that had once made her legendary among EOD specialists worldwide. Her fingers moved over dummy detonators in practice. Explosive devices with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, automatically checking connections, testing circuit integrity, and identifying potential failure points that could turn training exercises into real emergencies. The equipment at Camp Ironwood was poorly maintained. She realized a dangerous oversight that could result in accidents even during supposedly safe demonstrations. Diana began keeping detailed maintenance logs, documenting every deficiency and safety concern she discovered. The work was invisible to everyone else on base, performed in the quiet hours before the day shift arrived. But it represented something crucial: the return of the professional standards that had kept her alive. Through 3 combat deployments, her quarters underwent a similar transformation. The small space that had felt like a prison cell for months slowly evolved into something resembling a tactical operations center. Diana retrieved her personal collection of technical manuals from storage, reference materials that hadn't seen daylight since her forced retirement from active EOD duty. The books covered advanced explosive detection techniques, sophisticated detonator analysis, and threat assessment protocols that went far beyond anything taught in standard military training. She also unpacked a collection of tools that most people would have dismissed as random electronics equipment: wire strippers, multimeters, circuit testers, and specialized diagnostic devices that allowed her to analyze explosive components with laboratory-level precision. These weren't standard issue tools. They were the carefully assembled kit of someone who had spent years dealing with increasingly sophisticated threats. The real revelation came when Diana began reviewing intelligence reports from the Eastern European deployment zone. Her security clearance allowed access to classified threat assessments that painted a terrifying picture of what awaited the soldiers currently receiving inadequate training at Camp Ironwood. The explosive devices being used by hostile forces had evolved significantly since the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, incorporating electronic components and trigger mechanisms that required entirely different approaches to neutralization. Diana spread the intelligence reports across her small desk, cross-referencing threat patterns with the training protocols being used on base. The disconnect was staggering. Soldiers were being taught to recognize and respond to explosive devices that were essentially obsolete, while the actual threats they would face incorporated technology that hadn't existed during their instructor's limited field experience. She began drafting new training protocols, working late into the night to develop comprehensive curricula that addressed real-world threats rather than outdated scenarios. The work was complex and demanding, requiring her to synthesize intelligence from multiple sources and translate sophisticated technical concepts into teachable formats. But Diana's most important discovery came during a routine review of personnel records. Using her administrative access to prepare training rosters, she uncovered something that made her blood run cold. None of the current EOD instructors at Camp Ironwood had ever actually diffused a live explosive device in combat conditions. Their experience consisted entirely of training exercises and controlled demonstrations, making them utterly unprepared for the sophisticated threats documented in the intelligence reports. Captain Lawson's record was particularly revealing. Despite his swagger and condescending attitude, his actual EOD experience consisted of a single 6-month deployment to a relatively quiet sector where he had never encountered anything more dangerous than abandoned ordnance from previous conflicts. His training certifications were current, but they reflected classroom learning rather than the kind of life-or-death experience that created true expertise. Staff Sergeant Torres had never deployed at all, having spent his entire EOD career at stateside training facilities. The other instructors showed similar patterns, impressive-looking credentials that masked a complete lack of actual combat experience with explosive devices. Diana stared at the personnel records, finally understanding why the training at Camp Ironwood felt so inadequate. The people responsible for preparing soldiers to face sophisticated explosive threats had never actually faced such threats themselves. They were teaching from textbooks and manuals, passing along theoretical knowledge. That could get people killed when applied to real-world situations. Her revelations were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. Diana quickly closed the classified files and opened her quarters to find Sergeant Maya Patel standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of genuine concern. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Patel sighed quietly. "I noticed your light was still on and thought you might need some caffeine." Diana accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by the gesture of kindness. In 18 months at Camp Ironwood, very few people had shown her any consideration beyond basic military courtesy. "Thank you, Sergeant. That's very thoughtful." Patel stepped into the small quarters, her eyes immediately drawn to the technical manuals and electronic equipment arranged on Diana's desk. Her expression shifted from polite concern to something approaching awe as she recognized the sophistication of the materials. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to use this kind of equipment?" Patel gestured toward the diagnostic tools that Diana had been using to analyze training devices. Diana considered her response carefully. "Experience teaches you things that manuals can't capture, Sergeant. This isn't basic EOD equipment," Patel continued, her voice even quieter. "Now, these diagnostic tools are specialized gear used for advanced threat analysis. The kind of stuff they use at the FBI bomb lab." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Diana had acquired much of her equipment during advanced training courses that were reserved for only the most experienced explosive ordnance specialists. The tools represented years of professional development and access to resources that weren't available to ordinary EOD personnel. Everyone develops their own methods for staying current with evolving threats. Diana replied diplomatically. Patel picked up one of the technical manuals, flipping through pages dense with circuit diagrams and chemical analysis charts. "Ma'am, this manual covers explosive detection techniques that aren't taught in standard EOD school. This is graduate-level material." Diana felt a familiar tension in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced whenever someone got too close to discovering her true background. For 18 months, she'd successfully maintained the fiction that she was simply a washed-up veteran, assigned to PowerPoint duty. But Sergeant Patel's observational skills were making that fiction increasingly difficult to maintain. "Sergeant, what exactly are you asking?" Patel set down the manual and met Diana's eyes directly. "I'm asking why someone with your obvious expertise is being treated like an incompetent civilian contractor. I'm asking why Captain Lawson and his crew are allowed to dismiss advice from someone who clearly knows more about explosive ordnance than all of them combined." The directness of the question caught Diana off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to being underestimated and dismissed that genuine recognition of her abilities felt almost foreign. "Sergeant, I think you might be overestimating my background." "Ma'am, with respect, I've watched you inspect training equipment. I've seen the way you handle explosive components. That's not the work of someone who learned bomb disposal from PowerPoint presentations." Patel's voice carried a note of conviction that made arguing pointless. Diana sat down heavily in her desk chair, suddenly feeling the weight of 18 months of isolation and professional frustration. "What do you want me to say, Sergeant?" "I want you to tell me why you're letting them waste your expertise when soldiers' lives are at stake." Patel pulled up the small folding chair that Diana used for visitors. "Ma'am, I've read the intelligence reports about our upcoming deployment. The threats we're going to face are unlike anything most of these instructors have ever seen. We need real expertise, not theoretical knowledge from people who've never actually diffused a sophisticated device." The words hit Diana like artillery. Shells, each one perfectly targeted at the guilt and frustration she'd been carrying since Marcus Webb's death. She thought about the soldiers who would deploy with inadequate training, about the sophisticated threats they would face, and about her promise to ensure that other people didn't die because of poor preparation. "Sergeant," Diana said quietly, "sometimes the system isn't designed to recognize expertise when it doesn't come in the expected package." Patel leaned forward, her expression intense. "Then maybe it's time to make the system pay attention." For the first time in 18 months, Diana felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Not for vindication or recognition, but for the possibility that her knowledge might actually be used to keep people alive. "What did you have in mind, Sergeant?" Patel's smile was sharp and determined. "I have some ideas, ma'am. But first, I think it's time you stopped hiding who you really are." As they talked late into the night, Diana began to realize that her 18 months of isolation might finally be coming to an end. Someone had finally seen through the PowerPoint lady facade to recognize the expertise underneath. The question was whether it was too late to make a difference. The partnership between Diana and Sergeant Patel began to bear fruit within days, though their collaboration had to remain carefully hidden from the instructors who seemed determined to maintain the status quo of incompetence. Working during off hours and break periods, they began documenting the systematic deficiencies in Camp Ironwood's explosive ordnance training program with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed military investigators. Diana's analysis of the intelligence reports became the foundation for a comprehensive threat assessment that painted a disturbing picture of institutional failure. The explosive devices that soldiers would encounter in Eastern Europe incorporated electronic components, remote detonation systems, and chemical compositions that weren't covered in any of the training being provided at Camp Ironwood. Worse yet, several of the techniques being taught were not just outdated, they were actively dangerous when applied to modern explosive devices. "Ma'am, look at this," Patel said during one of their clandestine meetings in Diana's quarters, pointing to a training manual that Captain Lawson had been using for his demonstrations. "He's teaching soldiers to cut the red wire first on timer devices, but according to these intelligence reports, the devices in the deployment zone have been specifically designed to detonate when the red wire is severed." Diana examined the manual, her professional horror growing with each page. "This isn't just poor training, Sergeant. This is going to get people killed." They began compiling evidence of the dangerous misinformation being spread throughout the EOD training program, documenting specific instances where incorrect techniques were being taught as standard procedure. The work was painstaking and had to be conducted in complete secrecy, as any attempt to openly challenge the established training protocols would have resulted in immediate dismissal for both of them. Meanwhile, the daily humiliation at Camp Ironwood continued to escalate. Captain Lawson seemed to have interpreted Diana's recent professional confidence as a personal challenge to his authority, leading to increasingly public attempts to diminish her credibility. His latest tactic involved deliberately asking her technical questions during training sessions, then dismissing her answers as theoretical speculation from someone who lacked practical experience. "Torres," Lawson called out during a morning briefing, his voice carrying the false friendliness that Diana had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Since you've been so interested in our training protocols lately, maybe you can enlighten these soldiers about proper wire identification techniques for complex devices." The question was clearly intended as a trap. Diana could provide the correct answer, which would contradict the dangerous misinformation that Lawson had been teaching. Or she could remain silent and watch soldiers receive training that could prove fatal in actual combat situations. "Sir, wire identification requires careful analysis of the complete circuit pathway," Diana began, choosing her words carefully. "Color coding can be deliberately misleading in sophisticated devices, so proper procedure involves tracing the entire electrical system before making any cuts." Lawson's smile grew wider and more predatory. "That sounds very theoretical, Torres. In the real world, we don't have time for electrical engineering dissertations. Sometimes you just have to trust your training and cut the right wire." But sir, if the device has been designed with deceptive wiring, are you questioning established EOD procedures? Lawson interrupted, his voice carrying a note of dangerous authority. Because I seem to remember that your expertise comes from making PowerPoint presentations, not from actual fieldwork. The room fell silent as 30 soldiers watched this professional confrontation unfold. Diana felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but underneath it was something new, genuine anger. At watching life-saving information dismissed because of petty ego conflicts. I'm suggesting that updated intelligence requires updated procedures, Diana replied carefully. Corporal Grant chose that moment to interject with his trademark smirk. Ma'am, are you saying that your PowerPoint research is more reliable than actual EOD field manuals? The laughter that followed was particularly cruel because it came from soldiers who had no idea they were mocking someone whose expertise could save their lives. Diana watched their amused faces and realized that 18 months of systematic humiliation had created a culture where dismissing her knowledge had become a form of entertainment. That's enough, Lawson said, though his tone suggested he was enjoying the spectacle. Torres, I think we can handle the technical instruction from here. Why don't you focus on getting the visual aids ready for this afternoon's presentation? Diana gathered her materials and left the briefing room, but not before catching Sergeant Patel's eye. The expression on Patel's face reflected the same professional horror that Diana felt. They were watching soldiers receive training that would get them killed, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. The situation deteriorated further that afternoon during practical training exercises. Captain Lawson had set up a demonstration using the incorrectly wired training devices that Diana had identified weeks earlier, intending to show soldiers how to quickly and efficiently neutralize timer-based explosives. Diana watched from the designated observation area as Lawson approached the training device with the kind of confidence that came from never having faced consequences for his mistakes. He began explaining his technique to the assembled soldiers, describing procedures that would have resulted in immediate detonation if applied to the sophisticated devices documented in the intelligence reports. The key to effective bomb disposal, Lawson announced, is decisive action based on proven techniques. You can't hesitate or second-guess yourself when lives are on the line. He reached for the red wire that Diana knew had been configured to simulate a booby trap trigger. In a real-world scenario, cutting that wire would have killed everyone within a 50-meter radius. Captain, Diana called out, unable to remain silent. That device has been modified for advanced training. The wire configuration doesn't match standard patterns. Lawson paused, his hand hovering over the wire, and turned to face her with an expression of pure contempt. Torres, I told you to stay in the observation area. This is a practical demonstration for qualified personnel. Sir, I'm trying to prevent a training accident. That device is a basic timer mechanism that I've successfully demonstrated dozens of times, Lawson interrupted. Unless you're suggesting that I don't know how to handle standard EOD equipment. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Diana could insist on inspecting the device, which would require revealing her true background and expertise, or she could watch him demonstrate techniques that would prove fatal in actual combat conditions. Sir, I'm simply recommending caution with unfamiliar equipment configurations. Lawson's smile was sharp and dismissive. I appreciate your concern, but those of us with actual EOD experience can handle this. He cut the red wire with theatrical confidence, and the training device's simulation sequence activated normally. The soldiers applauded his technique, completely unaware that they had just watched a demonstration of how to commit suicide while attempting bomb disposal. Diana felt something snap inside her chest. She was watching soldiers learn procedures that would kill them, taught by instructors whose arrogance exceeded their expertise by dangerous margins. The promise she'd made to Marcus Webb to ensure that other soldiers received better Preparation was being systematically violated by people who cared more about their egos than about the lives they were supposed to protect. That evening, Diana and Sergeant Patel met in her quarters to review the day's events. The documentation they had compiled painted a comprehensive picture of institutional negligence that extended far beyond simple inadequate training. "Ma'am, we have enough evidence to justify a formal investigation," Patel said, reviewing their carefully assembled files. "The training deficiencies we've documented represent a clear and present danger to personnel safety." Diana stared at the evidence they had gathered, thinking about the soldiers who would deploy with lethal misinformation embedded in their training. "Sergeant, who exactly would we report this to?" "Captain Lawson's immediate superior is Colonel Pierce, who approved these training protocols in the first place. Then we go higher, Pentagon level if necessary. And they'll ask what qualifies us to challenge established EOD procedures. My official record shows 18 months as a PowerPoint instructor. Your background is in communications, not explosive. Ordnance disposal." Patel was quiet for a moment, understanding the impossible position they faced. "Ma'am, what if there was a situation where your real expertise became impossible to ignore?" Diana looked up from the files, seeing something calculating. In Patel's expression, "What kind of situation?" "The kind where academic credentials matter less than the ability to keep people alive." Before Diana could ask what she meant, the evening quiet was shattered by the base-wide alert system. The piercing tone that filled the air was one that every soldier recognized but hoped never to hear, the signal for a real emergency, not a drill. Both women rushed to the window, seeing vehicles racing toward the main barracks complex with emergency lights flashing. In the distance, they could hear shouting and the controlled chaos that accompanied genuine crisis situations. "Ma'am," Patel said quietly, "I think that situation just found us." The emergency alert system continued its piercing wail as Diana and Sergeant Patel rushed from the quarters toward the main barracks complex, joining a stream of personnel responding to what was clearly a genuine crisis rather than a scheduled drill. The organized chaos of military emergency response filled the air, shouting voices, running footsteps, and the distant sound of vehicles converging on a single location. Diana's trained instincts immediately began cataloging details that others might miss. The emergency vehicles were positioning themselves in a specific pattern, maintaining distances that suggested containment rather than immediate response. Military police had established a perimeter that extended far beyond what would be necessary for a standard medical emergency or equipment malfunction. Most telling of all, she could see Colonel Pierce himself directing operations from a command post that had been hastily established at what appeared to be a safe distance from the main barracks building. "Ma'am, that's not a standard emergency." "Response formation," Patel observed, her voice tight with growing concern. "They're treating this like a potential explosive situation." Diana's blood turned to ice water as the implications became clear. The positioning of vehicles, the extended perimeter, and the presence of senior command personnel all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Someone had discovered a potential bomb on the base. They reached the outer perimeter just as Captain Lawson arrived in a military vehicle, followed closely by Staff Sergeant Torres and the other EOD instructors. Diana watched as they conferred briefly with Colonel Pierce before approaching the barrier that had been established around the main barracks building. "What's the situation?" Lawson called out to the military police sergeant manning the perimeter. "Sir, maintenance personnel discovered a suspicious device in the basement mechanical room of Building 7. Initial assessment suggests it's an improvised explosive device of unknown sophistication." Diana felt her professional instincts surge to full alertness. Building 7 housed nearly 300 soldiers in the main barracks complex, and its basement mechanical room contained the electrical and heating systems that served the entire structure. An explosive device in that location could potentially cause catastrophic casualties. either through direct blast effects or by triggering secondary explosions in the building's infrastructure. Have you contacted the nearest EOD unit? Colonel Pierce demanded. Sir, the closest qualified bomb disposal team is at Fort Harrison, approximately 4 hours away by ground transport. Weather conditions are preventing helicopter evacuation. 4 hours. Diana's mind immediately began calculating the implications. If the device was equipped with a timer mechanism, 4 hours might be far too long to wait for professional assistance. If it was designed to detonate in response to movement or tampering, the entire building would need to be evacuated immediately. Captain Lawson stepped forward with the kind of confidence that Diana had learned to recognize as dangerous. Sir, I have EOD training and certification. I can conduct an initial assessment of the device. Are you qualified for this type of operation, Captain? Yes, sir. I've completed advanced EOD training and have experience with improvised explosive devices. Diana wanted to scream. Lawson's advanced training consisted of classroom exercises and controlled demonstrations with training devices. He had never faced a real explosive device under actual threat conditions, and his recent demonstrations had proven that he didn't understand the sophisticated techniques used by modern bomb makers. Very well, Captain. What do you need for your assessment? Basic EOD equipment and a small team to assist with evacuation procedures. We'll need to clear the building and establish a larger perimeter before I can approach the device. Colonel Pierce began issuing orders for building evacuation and extended perimeter establishment. Diana watched the organized chaos of emergency response, but her attention was focused on the terrifying reality that Captain Lawson was about to confront a potentially sophisticated explosive device with inadequate training and dangerous overconfidence. Ma'am, Patel whispered urgently, you have to say something. If that device is anything like the ones described in the intelligence reports, Captain Lawson's training won't be sufficient. Diana felt the familiar paralysis of self-doubt. For 18 months, she had been systematically dismissed and humiliated by these same people. Her attempts to share expertise had been rejected, her warnings ignored, and her professional credibility destroyed. Why would they listen to her now, when the stakes were higher than ever? Sergeant, they won't listen to me. I'm just the PowerPoint lady, remember? Ma'am, if you're right about Captain Lawson's inadequate training, people are going to die. That has to matter more than your pride or their prejudices. The building evacuation proceeded with military efficiency, but Diana could see signs of panic beginning to spread among the personnel streaming out of the barracks. Word was spreading that there was a bomb in the building, and the extended perimeter suggested that the threat was being taken very seriously by command personnel. Captain Lawson emerged from the equipment depot wearing a basic EOD protective suit and carrying a standard bomb disposal toolkit. Diana's professional assessment of his equipment was immediate and horrifying. He was carrying gear designed for training exercises and basic explosive devices, not for the sophisticated threats described in the intelligence reports. Ma'am, look at his equipment, Patel said, echoing Diana's thoughts. That's not advanced EOD gear, that's basic training equipment. Diana watched as Lawson approached the building entrance, his movements broadcasting the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for mistakes. She thought about the intelligence reports she had analyzed, the sophisticated devices being used in the deployment zone, and the dangerous misinformation that had been incorporated into Camp Ironwood's training program. Sergeant, I need to get closer to the situation. If that device is anything like the ones in the intelligence reports, Captain Lawson is walking into a death trap. They moved carefully through the organized chaos of the emergency response, positioning themselves where they could observe the developing situation without interfering with official operations. Diana's trained eye immediately began assessing the tactical situation, looking for signs that might indicate the nature of the threat they were facing. The first clue came from the military police officers who had discovered the device. Diana overheard their conversation with Colonel Pierce, describing a sophisticated-looking device with multiple electronic components and wire configurations that didn't match standard improvised explosive patterns. "Sir, the device appears to have electronic timing mechanisms and what looks like anti-tampering features," the MP reported. "It's unlike anything we've seen in standard training scenarios." Diana's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't a simple pipe bomb or basic improvised device. The description matched the sophisticated threats described in the intelligence reports devices, specifically designed to defeat conventional bomb disposal techniques. Captain Lawson's voice crackled over the radio system. "Command, I'm approaching the device now. Initial visual assessment suggests a complex improvised explosive device with multiple components." Diana felt sick. Through the radio communications, she could hear Lawson describing the device using terminology that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of what he was facing. He was applying training concepts designed for basic explosive devices to a sophisticated threat that required entirely different approaches. "Ma'am, he's going to get himself killed," Patel said quietly. "Worse than that, Sergeant. If he triggers that device, the blast could bring down the entire building. We're talking about potential casualties in the hundreds." The radio crackled. "Again, Command, I'm beginning preliminary analysis of the device. It appears to be a timer-based system with standard wire configurations." Diana's blood ran cold. There was nothing standard about the device Lawson was describing. The intelligence reports had specifically warned about devices designed to appear conventional while incorporating sophisticated anti-tampering features. "Ma'am, you have to do something. You're the only person here who understands what he's really facing." Diana looked at the command post where Colonel Pierce was monitoring the situation, surrounded by officers who had spent 18 months dismissing her expertise. She thought about Marcus Webb, about the promise she had made to ensure that other soldiers received better preparation, and about the hundreds of lives that hung in the balance. "Sergeant, if I approach that command post and try to explain the situation, they'll dismiss me as a panicking civilian contractor. They won't listen until it's too late." "Then what do you suggest, ma'am?" Diana stared at the building where Captain Lawson was confronting a threat he didn't understand with training that would get him killed. The decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity that came from years of making life-or-death choices. Under extreme pressure, "I suggest we get ready to do something very stupid, Sergeant. Something that will either save lives or get us both court-martialed." The radio crackled one final time. "Command, beginning wire analysis now. Estimate 15 minutes for safe disposal." Diana closed her eyes, knowing that 15 minutes was far too long. The device Lawson was describing would have multiple fail-safe mechanisms designed to prevent exactly the kind of approach he was attempting. "Ma'am, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that it's time for the PowerPoint lady to remind everyone what she used to do for a living. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The next 20 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe that Diana could see coming, but seemed powerless to prevent. Captain Lawson's voice continued to crackle over the radio system, describing his analysis of the device with terminology that made Diana's professional blood run cold. Every technical assessment he provided demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of what he was facing. "Command, I've identified what appears to be a standard timer mechanism with red and blue wire configurations," Lawson reported, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never encountered a device designed to kill bomb disposal experts. "The device appears to be following conventional IED patterns from the Iraq conflict." Diana wanted to scream. The intelligence reports had specifically warned about devices that appeared conventional while incorporating sophisticated anti-tampering features. The fact that the device looked familiar was precisely what made it so dangerous. It was designed to lure inexperienced technicians into applying outdated techniques that would trigger immediate detonation. "Ma'am, he's walking into a trap," Patel whispered, her voice tight with growing horror. Everything he's describing matches the deceptive device patterns from the intelligence reports. Diana nodded grimly. The device Lawson was analyzing had been specifically designed to defeat the kind of basic bomb disposal techniques taught in standard EOD training. It would appear simple and conventional until the moment someone attempted to neutralize it using traditional methods. The radio crackled. "Again, Command, I'm beginning wire analysis now. Based on standard protocols, I should be able to neutralize this device within 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Diana's mind immediately began calculating the implications. If the device was equipped with the kind of sophisticated anti-tampering features described in the intelligence reports, Lawson's first attempt at wire manipulation would trigger sensors designed to detect unauthorized access. The resulting explosion would not only kill him instantly but could potentially bring down the entire building structure. Colonel Pierce's voice came through the radio. "Captain, are you confident in your assessment? We have 300 personnel evacuated from that building." "Yes, sir. This is a standard improvised explosive device. I've handled similar threats during my deployment experience." Diana closed her eyes, knowing that Lawson's similar threats consisted of training exercises with dummy devices that bore no resemblance to the sophisticated bomb he was currently analyzing. His deployment experience had involved disposal of abandoned ordnance, not the diffusing of active devices designed by skilled bomb makers. "Ma'am, we have to do something," Patel said urgently. "If he triggers that device, the blast could collapse the building's support structure. We're talking about potential casualties that go far beyond the immediate blast radius." Diana looked at the command post where Colonel Pierce was monitoring the situation, surrounded by officers who had spent 18 months treating her like an incompetent civilian contractor. The irony was staggering. The person with the most relevant expertise was being kept at a distance, while someone with inadequate training risked catastrophic failure. "Sergeant, even if I could convince them to listen, what would I tell them? That I've been hiding my real background for 18 months? That I've been analyzing intelligence reports that technically exceed my clearance level? Ma'am, you tell them that you're the only person here who understands what Captain Lawson is really facing." The radio transmission that followed made Diana's worst fears reality. "Command, I've identified the primary detonation circuit. Beginning neutralization sequence now." Diana felt her professional instincts surge to full alertness. The primary detonation circuit that Lawson had identified was almost certainly a decoy designed to trigger anti-tampering sensors. The real detonation mechanism would be hidden behind secondary circuits that required sophisticated analysis to detect. "Ma'am, look at the command post," Patel said, pointing toward Colonel Pierce's position. "They're celebrating. They think this is almost over." Diana could see the relaxed postures and relieved expressions of the command personnel. They believed that Captain Lawson had successfully identified and neutralized the threat, not understanding that he was about to trigger a device designed to kill bomb disposal experts. The radio crackled with what would be Lawson's final transmission. "Command, I'm cutting the primary wire now. Device should be neutralized in 30 seconds. Diana's training kicked in with crystal clarity. She had perhaps 20 seconds before Lawson's wire cut would trigger the anti-tampering sensors. 20 seconds to cover the distance between her current position and the command post. 20 seconds to convince people who had dismissed her expertise for 18 months that she was the only person who could prevent catastrophic casualties. "Sergeant, I need you to create a distraction at the command post. Something that will get Colonel Pierce's attention without alerting him to what I'm planning." "Ma'am, what are you planning?" I'm planning to save Captain Lawson's life and prevent the deaths of 300 soldiers, even if it means revealing everything I've been hiding for the past 18 months. Patel nodded grimly. What kind of distraction? Tell them you've received intelligence about similar devices in the deployment zone. Make them think there's additional information they need to consider. And then I'm going to do something that will either save this base or get me court-martialed for insubordination. Diana began moving toward the command post, her mind automatically calculating distances and time frames. She had perhaps 15 seconds before Lawson's wire cut would trigger the device's anti-tampering sensors. 15 seconds to convince Colonel Pierce that the PowerPoint lady he had dismissed for 18 months was actually the most qualified EAD specialist on the base. "Ma'am, one more thing," Patel called out softly. "What if they still don't listen?" Diana paused, thinking about Marcus Webb, about the promise she had made to ensure that other soldiers received better preparation, and about the hundreds of lives that hung in the balance. "Then I'm going to do something that violates every protocol in the book, Sergeant. I'm going to save them whether they want me to or not." The radio crackled one final time. "Command, wire cut in progress. Device neutralization in 10 seconds. Diana broke into a run toward the command post, knowing that she had less than 10 seconds to prevent a catastrophe that would define her life forever. Behind her, she could hear Patel beginning her distraction, approaching the perimeter guards with urgent questions about deployment. Intelligence. Colonel Pierce was standing with his back to her, monitoring the radio communications with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from believing the crisis was nearly over. Diana could see Staff Sergeant Torres checking his watch, probably calculating how long it would take to process the paperwork for a successful bomb disposal operation. "Colonel Pierce," Diana called out, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. "You need to stop Captain Lawson immediately. He's about to trigger an anti-tampering device." Pierce turned around, his expression shifting from relief to confusion to annoyance in the space of a heartbeat. "Torres, what are you doing here? This is a restricted area." "Sir, the device Captain Lawson is analyzing has been designed to defeat conventional bomb disposal techniques. The wire he's about to cut will trigger sensors that will detonate the device immediately. Torres, Captain Lawson is a qualified EOD specialist. I think he can handle." The radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone freeze. "Command, I've encountered resistance in the wire. The cut isn't proceeding as expected." Diana's blood turned to ice. The resistance Lawson was encountering was exactly what happened when someone attempted to cut a wire protected by anti-tampering sensors. He had perhaps 5 seconds before the device's sophisticated detection systems would register unauthorized access and trigger immediate detonation. "Colonel, you have to order him to stop immediately. That resistance means he's triggered the device's defense systems." Pierce stared at her, his mind clearly struggling to process the possibility that the PowerPoint lady he had dismissed for 18 months might actually understand the situation better than his qualified EOD specialist. "Torres, how could you possibly know?" "Because I've defused 47 devices just like this one, sir. And because Captain Lawson is about to get himself killed along with everyone in that building." The radio crackled again. "Command wire is not cutting properly. I'm going to apply additional pressure." Diana looked at Colonel Pierce, seeing the moment of decision crystallizing in his expression. He could continue to dismiss her expertise and watch his EOD specialist trigger a catastrophic explosion, or he could trust the PowerPoint lady whose background he had never bothered to investigate. "Sir, you have approximately 3 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether Captain Lawson lives or dies." Pierce grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Captain Lawson, abort the wire cut immediately. Do not proceed with neutralization." "Sir, I'm almost through the wire. Just need another second. Captain, This is a direct order. Step away from the device immediately." The radio went silent for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then Lawson's voice crackled through the static. "Command, I've stepped away from the device. Wire cut is incomplete." Diana felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Captain Lawson was still alive, which meant there was still time to prevent the catastrophic explosion that would have killed him and potentially brought down the entire building. But now came the hard part, convincing Colonel Pierce to let the PowerPoint lady take over an operation that could determine the fate of everyone on Camp Ironwood. The silence that followed Captain Lawson's transmission was broken only by the distant sound of evacuation vehicles and the low hum of emergency equipment. Colonel Pierce stared at Diana with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, suspicion, and dawning realization that the woman he had dismissed for 18 months might actually know what she was talking about. "Torres," Pierce said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged. "How did you know that Captain Lawson was about to trigger an anti-tampering device?" Diana took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save lives or end her military career permanently. "Sir, because I've encountered devices exactly like this one during my previous assignments." The resistance pattern Captain Lawson described is characteristic of pressure-sensitive wire protection systems. "Your previous assignments?" Pierce's voice carried a note of dangerous skepticism. "Your personnel file shows 18 months as a tactical presentation specialist. There's no mention of explosive ordnance disposal experience." "That's because my EO'd service record was classified." "At my request, sir. I preferred to start fresh at Camp Ironwood without my previous background affecting how I was perceived." Staff Sergeant Torres stepped forward, his expression openly hostile. "Sir, with respect, this is exactly the kind of attention-seeking behavior we've come to expect from." "Sergeant," Pierce interrupted sharply, "I want to hear what she has to say." Diana felt the weight of 18 months of accumulated humiliation and professional dismissal pressing down on her shoulders. Every instinct told her to retreat, to step back into the shadows where she had hidden for so long. But Captain Lawson's life hung in the balance, along with the lives of 300 soldiers who had no idea how close they were to catastrophe. "Sir, the device Captain Lawson is analyzing incorporates sophisticated anti-tampering features that aren't covered in standard EOD training. The wire configurations he's describing are designed to appear conventional while actually being connected to sensors that trigger immediate detonation when disturbed." Pierce studied her face carefully, clearly trying to assess whether she was exhibiting genuine expertise or simply parroting information she had read somewhere. "Torres, if what you're saying is true, then Captain Lawson could have been killed." "Yes, sir. And the secondary explosion could have brought down the entire building structure, resulting in casualties that would extend far beyond the immediate blast radius." The radio crackled again. "Command, I'm maintaining distance from the device as ordered, but I need guidance on how to proceed. The wire I was cutting appears to be under some kind of tension." Diana felt her professional instincts surge to full alertness. The tension Lawson was describing was exactly what happened when someone attempted to cut a wire protected by anti-tampering sensors. The device was now in a heightened state of sensitivity, making any further approach extremely dangerous. "Colonel," Diana said urgently, "Captain Lawson needs to maintain his current position and avoid any further contact with the device. The tension he's describing means the anti-tampering system is partially activated." Pierce grabbed his radio. "Captain, maintain your current position. Do not approach the device until further notice." "Sir, I need to complete the neutralization. The longer we wait, the greater the risk to personnel." "Captain, that's a direct order." "Maintain distance." Pierce turned back to Diana, his expression showing the first signs of genuine respect she had seen in 18 months. "Torres, if you're right about this device, Then we need professional EOD assistance. The nearest qualified team is 4 hours away. Sir, 4 hours may be too long. If this device is equipped with the kind of sophisticated timing mechanisms I suspect, it could be programmed to detonate on a predetermined schedule regardless of our actions. Then what do you suggest? Diana felt the moment of truth arriving. Like an avalanche. She could continue to offer advice from the sidelines, maintaining the fiction that she was simply a well-informed civilian contractor. Or she could reveal the truth about her background and take responsibility for a situation that required exactly the kind of expertise she had been hiding for 18 months. Sir, I suggest you allow me to approach the device and conduct a proper assessment of its configuration. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Pierce stared at her with an expression that suggested he was trying to reconcile the PowerPoint lady he had dismissed with the confident professional now standing before him. Torres, what exactly are you qualified to handle? Diana reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather case that she had carried for years but never opened at Camp Ironwood. Inside was her EOD specialist certification, her security clearance, documentation, and a small metal pin that bore the insignia of the most elite bomb disposal unit in the military. Pierce examined the credentials with growing amazement. Staff Sergeant Diana Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, 247 successful device neutralizations. Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire. He looked up from the documentation, his expression showing complete bewilderment. Torres, why didn't you tell us about this background? Because I wanted to start fresh, sir. I wanted to contribute to training without the burden of past achievements affecting how soldiers perceived the information I was providing. Staff Sergeant Torres stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and growing anger. Sir, this is highly irregular. We don't know if these credentials are legitimate, and even if they are, there's no way to verify her current competency. Diana met his gaze directly. Sergeant, you're absolutely right to question my current competency. I've been out of active EOD duty for 18 months, and skills deteriorate without regular practice. Pierce looked between them, clearly struggling with a decision that could determine the fate of his entire command. Torres, if your credentials are legitimate, then you're the most qualified EAD specialist on this base. But if you're wrong about this device, or if your skills have deteriorated as you suggest, then we're risking not only Captain Lawson's life, but potentially hundreds of others. Yes, sir. I understand the stakes completely. The radio crackled again. Command, I'm detecting what sounds like electronic beeping from the device. It wasn't making that sound before. Diana's blood turned to ice. Electronic beeping from a previously silent device meant only one thing. The timing mechanism had been activated, either by Lawson's tampering or by a predetermined schedule. They were now operating under a countdown that could end in catastrophic explosion at any moment. Colonel, Diana said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of making life or death decisions under extreme pressure. That beeping means the device is now operating under a timer mechanism. We no longer have the luxury of waiting for outside assistance. Pierce stared at her, seeing something in her expression that transcended their months of institutional dismissal and professional humiliation. Torres, what do you need? I need proper EOD equipment, a direct radio link to Captain Lawson, and authorization to approach the device immediately. Based on the beeping pattern he's describing, we probably have less than 10 minutes before detonation. Pierce made his decision with the kind of decisive authority that defined effective military leadership. You have everything you need. Staff Sergeant Torres, get her whatever equipment she requests. Sir, I strongly advise against. Sergeant. That's an order. Diana felt a surge of professional confidence that she hadn't experienced in 18 months. Colonel, I'll need Captain Lawson to maintain his current position and provide detailed descriptions of everything he observes. His eyes will be my primary source of information about the device's configuration. Understood. What else? Sir, I need everyone to understand that if this device is as sophisticated as I suspect, the next 8 minutes will determine whether Camp Ironwood experiences a minor equipment malfunction or a catastrophic explosion that kills hundreds of people. Pierce nodded grimly. Torres, you have 8 minutes to prove that the PowerPoint lady we dismissed is actually the expert we desperately need. Diana picked up the radio handset, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Captain Lawson, this is Staff Sergeant Caldwell. I'm going to need you to be my eyes and ears for the next few minutes. Can you give me a detailed description of exactly what you're seeing? The radio crackled with Lawson's voice, now stripped of its previous confidence. Ma'am, I'm looking at a device that's much more complex than anything I've encountered before. And that beeping is getting faster. Diana closed her eyes, visualizing the device based on Lawson's description and her knowledge of sophisticated anti-tampering systems. She thought about Marcus Webb, about the promise she had made to ensure that other soldiers received better preparation, and about the hundreds of lives that now depended on skills she had been hiding for 18 months. Captain, I need you to trust me completely. We're going to defuse this device together, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly, no matter how unconventional they might seem. Ma'am, I'm ready to follow your lead. The PowerPoint lady was dead. In her place stood Staff Sergeant Diana Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, preparing to demonstrate why she had once been considered the most capable bomb disposal specialist in the military. The countdown had begun. Captain Lawson, I need you to take 3 deep breaths and clear your mind of everything you think you know about bomb disposal, Diana said into the radio, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of talking people through life or death situations. For the next 8 minutes, you're going to be my hands while I'm your brain. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, I understand. Diana closed her eyes, visualizing the device based on Lawson's earlier descriptions and her knowledge of sophisticated anti-tampering systems. The electronic beeping he had reported was increasing in frequency, which meant they were operating under a countdown timer that would reach 0 in approximately 8 minutes. Captain, I need you to describe the device's physical layout without touching anything. Start with the overall shape and size, then move to the electronic components. Ma'am, the device appears to be approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. It's housed in what looks like a modified ammunition case. There are multiple electronic components visible, including what appears to be a digital display, several circuit boards, and approximately 12 wires of different colors. Diana's mental image of the device began to crystallize. The modified ammunition case was a common housing for sophisticated IEDs because it provided protection for electronic components while appearing innocuous to casual observation. The multiple circuit boards suggested redundant systems designed to prevent successful neutralization. Captain, can you see the digital display clearly? I need to know what information it's showing. Ma'am, the display shows numbers that appear to be counting down. Currently reading 7 minutes and 34 seconds. Diana felt her professional instincts surge to full alertness. A visible countdown timer was unusual for sophisticated devices, as it provided information that could be used by bomb disposal specialists. The fact that this device included such a display suggested either overconfidence by the bomb maker or a psychological component designed to increase pressure on anyone attempting neutralization. Captain, I need you to look at the wire configurations. Without getting closer to the device, can you identify any wires that appear to be connected to the display mechanism? Ma'am, there are 3 wires that appear to connect to the back of the digital display. 2 are black, 1 is white. Diana's mind began processing the implications. The dual black wires suggested a redundant power system, which meant that cutting one would not disable the timer mechanism. The white wire could be either a data connection or a trap designed to trigger immediate detonation if severed. Captain, I need you to trace the black wires as far as you can see without moving closer to the device. Tell me where they lead. Ma'am, both black wires appear to connect to what looks like a battery pack located on the left side of the device. The battery pack appears to be custom built with multiple cells. Diana's professional concern deepened. A custom battery pack suggested that the device had been designed for extended operation, possibly with enough power to maintain the countdown timer and anti-tampering systems for hours or even days. This was not a simple bomb designed for immediate detonation. Captain, now I need you to look at the circuit boards. Can you identify any components that appear to be sensors or detection devices? Ma'am, there are several small cylindrical components that I don't recognize. They appear to be connected to wires that lead to different parts of the device. Diana felt her worst fears being confirmed. The cylindrical components Lawson was describing were almost certainly vibration sensors, pressure sensors, or motion detectors designed to trigger detonation if anyone attempted to move or manipulate the device. Captain, those cylindrical components are anti-tampering sensors. They're designed to detect any unauthorized access to the device. That's why you experienced resistance when you attempted to cut the wire earlier. The radio crackled with Lawson's voice, now carrying a note of genuine fear. Ma'am, are you saying that any attempt to neutralize this device could trigger immediate detonation? Captain, I'm saying that this device was specifically designed to kill bomb disposal specialists, but it was also designed by someone who understood conventional EOD techniques. The key to defeating it is using unconventional approaches. Diana opened her eyes and looked at Colonel Pierce, who was monitoring the radio communications with an expression of growing horror. Sir, I need you to understand that what we're facing is not a standard explosive device. This is a sophisticated weapon designed to defeat trained EOD personnel. Torres, what are options? Sir, we have two choices. We can maintain the current perimeter and hope that the device doesn't have enough explosive power to cause casualties beyond the immediate blast radius. Or we can attempt to neutralize it using techniques that aren't taught in standard EOD training. Pierce stared at her, understanding the implications immediately. Torres, if you attempt neutralization and fail, the explosion could kill Captain Lawson and potentially bring down the entire building. Yes, sir. But if we don't attempt neutralization, the device will detonate automatically in approximately 6 minutes and 40 seconds, with the same potential casualties. The radio crackled again. Ma'am, the beeping is getting noticeably faster. The display now shows 6 minutes and 38 seconds. Diana felt the familiar zone of absolute focus settling over her like a comfortable blanket. This was the moment when years of training and experience would determine whether people lived or died. The pressure was enormous, but it was also familiar. She had faced similar situations dozens of times during her deployment years. Captain, I'm going to walk you through a neutralization sequence that will seem counterintuitive based on your training. I need you to trust me completely and follow my instructions exactly, even if they contradict everything you've learned about bomb disposal. Ma'am, I'm ready to follow your lead. Diana began the most important briefing of her career. Captain, CONVENTION, ALEOD training teaches us to disable the power source first, then neutralize the detonation mechanism. But this device has been designed to defeat that approach. Instead, we're going to use the device's own sophistication against it. Ma'am, I don't understand. Captain, sophisticated devices like this one rely on complex electronic systems to function properly. Those systems have vulnerabilities that can be exploited if you know how to identify them. Diana looked at the assembled command personnel, all of whom were listening to radio communications that would determine the fate of their installation. Captain, I need you to locate the white wire that connects to the digital display. Can you trace it to its other connection point? Ma'am, the white wire appears to connect to a small electronic component that I don't recognize. It's located between the two main circuit boards. Diana's mental image of the device became clearer. The white wire was probably a data connection that carried timing information between the display and the main control system. If her analysis was correct, that wire could be the key to defeating the device's anti-tampering systems. Captain, the component you're describing is probably a data processor that controls the timing mechanism. The white wire carries information between the display and the main control system. Ma'am, does that help us neutralize the device? Captain, it might. But what I'm about to ask you to do will contradict everything you've learned about bomb disposal. Are you prepared for that? The radio was silent for a moment before Lawson's voice crackled through. Ma'am, I'm prepared to follow your instructions regardless of how unconventional they seem. Diana took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save lives or result in catastrophic failure. Captain, I need you to very carefully approach the device and disconnect the white wire from the data processor. But you must do it in a very specific way that won't trigger the anti-tampering sensors. Ma'am, how do I disconnect a wire without triggering sensors designed to detect tampering? Captain, you don't disconnect it. You're going to overload it. The radio crackled with confusion. Ma'am, I don't understand what you mean by overload. Diana looked at her watch, seeing that they had less than 5 minutes before the countdown reached 0. Captain, I'm going to guide you through a technique that uses the device's own power source to disable its control systems. It's dangerous, but it's our only option. Ma'am, I'm ready. Captain, the next 4 minutes will determine whether we save this base or lose it. Are you ready to trust me completely? Ma'am, I'm ready to follow your lead. Diana began the most critical instructions of her career, knowing that every word could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. The PowerPoint lady was gone forever, replaced by the expert she had always been underneath. Captain, let's begin. Captain, I need you to locate the main power coupling between the battery pack and the primary circuit board, Diana said, her voice carrying the steady confidence that came from years of making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. It should appear as a thick black wire with a connector that looks different from the others. Ma'am, I can see what appears to be a main power connection. It's a thick black wire with a white connector that's larger than the others. Diana's mental image of the device crystallized with perfect clarity. The white connector was exactly what she had expected, a main power coupling that could be exploited to overload the device's control systems. Captain, that's exactly what we need. Now I need you to locate any loose wires or components that might have been left by the bomb maker. Ma'am, there are several wire segments that appear to be excess material. They're coiled near the battery pack. Perfect. Captain, I need you to very carefully take one of those excess wire segments and prepare to create a short circuit between the main power coupling and the data processor. But you must do it in a very specific sequence. The radio crackled with Lawson's voice, now carrying complete trust in Diana's expertise. Ma'am, I'm ready to follow your instructions exactly. Diana looked at her watch, seeing that they had less than 3 minutes before the countdown reached 0. Captain, the technique I'm about to guide you through will cause the device's control systems to overload and shut down, but the timing has to be perfect or will trigger the anti-tampering sensors. Ma'am, I understand. What's the first step? Captain, I need you to position the excess wire so that one end is touching the main power coupling and the other end is approximately 1 inch away from the data processor. Do not complete the connection yet. Ma'am, I have the wire positioned as you described. Diana's training kicked in with crystal clarity. She had performed similar procedures dozens of times during her deployment years, but never with someone else serving as her hands. The technique required precise timing and complete trust between the two participants. Captain, I need you to listen carefully to the beeping pattern from the device. When I give you the signal, you're going to complete the connection between the wire and the data processor. But you must do it during the pause between beeps. Ma'am, I can hear the beeping pattern. There's approximately a half-second pause between each beep. That's correct. The pause represents the moment when the anti-tampering sensors reset their detection cycles. If you complete the connection during that pause, the sensors won't register it as unauthorized tampering. Diana felt the familiar zone of absolute focus settling over her consciousness. This was the moment when years of training and experience would determine whether people lived or died. The pressure was enormous, but it was also familiar. She had faced similar situations dozens of times during her combat deployments. Captain, I want you to practice the motion without completing the connection. Just move the wire toward the data processor during the pause, then pull it back. Ma'am, I've practiced the motion. I think I can time it correctly. Captain, we only get one chance at this. If the timing is wrong, the anti-tampering sensors will trigger immediate detonation. The radio crackled with Lawson's voice, now carrying absolute determination. Ma'am, I trust your expertise completely. I'm ready to make the connection. Diana looked at her watch, seeing that they had less than 90 seconds before the countdown reached 0. Captain, on my count, you're going to complete the connection. I need you to listen to the beeping pattern and wait for my signal. Ma'am, I'm ready. Captain, the beeping pattern is about to change. As we get closer to 0, the pauses will become shorter. We need to make the connection within the next 30 seconds. Diana felt her heart rate slow to the steady rhythm that had carried her through the most dangerous moments of her career. This was what she had been trained for, what she had spent years perfecting, and what she had been hiding from for 18 months. Captain, listen to the beeping pattern. Wait for the pause. On my mark ... 3.2.1. Mark, the radio went silent for what felt like an eternity. Then Lawson's voice crackled through with explosive relief. Ma'am, I've completed the connection. The beeping has stopped. The digital display is showing error messages. Diana felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. The overload technique had worked exactly as she had calculated. The device's control systems had been disabled by their own sophistication, leaving the explosive components inert and safe. Captain, can you confirm that the digital display is no longer showing a countdown timer? Ma'am, the display is showing what appears to be system error messages. No countdown timer is visible. Diana looked at Colonel Pierce, who was staring at her with an expression of complete amazement. Sir, the device has been successfully neutralized. Captain Lawson can safely withdraw from the area. Pierce grabbed his radio with shaking hands. Captain, you are authorized to withdraw from the building immediately. Move to the perimeter and report to the command post. Yes, sir, withdrawing now. The assembled command personnel began to cheer, but Diana felt only the familiar exhaustion that followed high-stress operations. She had successfully defused another sophisticated device, but this time the victory felt different. This time, she had done it while revealing her true expertise to people who had dismissed her for 18 months. Torres, Colonel Pierce said quietly, I owe you an apology. We all do. Diana looked at the faces surrounding her officers who had spent months treating her like an incompetent civilian contractor, now realizing they had been in the presence of one of the most skilled bomb disposal specialists in the military. Sir, number apology is necessary. I chose to conceal my background when I accepted this assignment. Staff Sergeant Torres stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Ma'am, I was wrong about everything. Your expertise just saved hundreds of lives. Diana felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. She had finally received the recognition she deserved, but it had taken a near-catastrophic situation to achieve it. Sergeant, we all make assumptions about people based on incomplete information. The important thing is that we learn from those mistakes. Captain Lawson's voice crackled over the radio. Command, I've reached the perimeter. The device appears to be completely inert. Diana felt the final wave of relief wash over her. The crisis was over, the base was safe, and no one had been hurt. But more importantly, she had honored her promise to Marcus Webb by ensuring that other soldiers received the expert guidance they needed to survive dangerous situations. "Ma'am," Sergeant Patel said, approaching with a smile of genuine admiration, "I think it's time everyone knew who they've really been working with." Diana looked at the assembled personnel, seeing respect and recognition in their expressions for the first time in 18 months. The PowerPoint lady was truly dead, replaced by Staff Sergeant Diana Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, the expert she had always been underneath. "Colonel," Diana said quietly, "I believe we have some training protocols to update. The techniques that Captain Lawson encountered today aren't covered in our current curriculum." Pierce nodded emphatically. "Torres, I want you to take over the entire EOD training program immediately. We need to ensure that our soldiers are prepared for the threats they'll actually face." Diana felt a surge of professional satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. Finally, she would be able to provide soldiers with the kind of expert training that could save their lives in real-world situations. "Sir, I'd be honored to develop a comprehensive training program based on current threat assessments." As the emergency personnel began to disperse and the crisis protocols were officially terminated, Diana found herself surrounded by soldiers who wanted to understand how the PowerPoint lady had transformed into the expert who had just saved their base. The transformation was complete. The Quiet One had finally shown everyone what real expertise looked like, and Camp Ironwood would never be the same. The debriefing session that followed the successful neutralization of the explosive device was unlike anything Diana had experienced during her 18 months at Camp Ironwood. Instead of sitting in the back of the room as a dismissed observer, she found herself at the head of the conference table, with Colonel Pierce and the entire command staff hanging on her every word as she explained the sophisticated anti-tampering features that had nearly cost Captain Lawson his life. "The device we encountered today represents a significant evolution in improvised explosive technology," Diana began, her voice carrying the authority that came from genuine expertise rather than borrowed confidence. "The bomb maker incorporated multiple redundant systems specifically designed to defeat conventional EOD techniques." Captain Lawson sat at the table with an expression of profound humility, still processing how close he had come to triggering a catastrophic explosion. "Ma'am, I want to publicly acknowledge that I was completely unprepared for what we encountered today. Without your expertise, I would have been killed along with potentially hundreds of others." Diana nodded respectfully. "Captain, the device was designed to defeat the exact training protocols that we've been teaching here at Camp Ironwood. Your response was entirely consistent with established procedures. The problem wasn't with your execution, it was with the inadequacy of our training curriculum." Staff Sergeant Torres, who had spent months dismissing Diana's expertise, now looked physically ill as he contemplated the implications of what had nearly happened. "Ma'am, I owe you a profound apology. I was wrong about everything, and my attitude could have contributed to a catastrophic failure. Sergeant, we all make assumptions about people based on incomplete information. The important thing is that we learn from this experience and use it to improve our training protocols." Colonel Pierce leaned forward, his expression showing genuine respect for perhaps the first time since Diana had arrived at Camp Ironwood. "Torres, I want you to know that I've already initiated the process to update your personnel file to reflect your actual background and qualifications. Your service record will show your true expertise, not the civilian contractor status you requested." Diana felt a complex mix of relief and trepidation. For 18 months, she had hidden behind the anonymity of being a PowerPoint instructor, but now her true identity would be impossible to conceal. "Sir, I appreciate that, but I hope the change won't affect my ability to work effectively with soldiers who might be intimidated by my background." "Ma'am, if I may," interrupted Sergeant Patel, "I think you'll find that soldiers respond better to instructors who have genuine expertise rather than those who are simply following manual procedures." The observation was accompanied by nods of agreement from around the table. Diana realized that her 18 months of patient endurance had actually created a foundation of respect that would serve her well in her new role. "Torres, I want you to take over the entire explosive ordnance disposal training program immediately," Colonel Pierce announced. "You'll have complete authority to redesign curriculum, update equipment, and implement whatever changes you deem necessary to prepare our soldiers for the threats they'll actually face." Diana felt a surge of professional satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. Finally, she would be able to provide soldiers with the kind of expert training that could save their lives in real-world situations. "Sir, I'd like to begin by conducting a comprehensive assessment of current training materials and identifying areas where updated intelligence should be incorporated. You have whatever resources you need. Budget, personnel, equipment, whatever it takes to ensure that what happened today never happens again." The meeting continued for another hour, with Diana explaining the sophisticated techniques that modern bomb makers were using and the corresponding countermeasures that needed to be incorporated into training programs. As she spoke, she could see the assembled officers beginning to understand just how inadequate their previous training had been. "Ma'am," Captain Lawson said as the meeting concluded, "I'd like to formally request assignment to your new training program. I want to learn from someone who actually knows what they're talking about." Diana smiled, seeing genuine humility in his expression. "Captain, I'd be honored to have you as part of the team. Your experience today will be invaluable in helping other soldiers understand the real dangers of overconfidence." As the officers began to disperse, Diana found herself approached by soldiers who had spent months treating her like an incompetent civilian contractor. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. Where once there had been dismissive smirks, now there was genuine respect and curiosity about her background. "Ma'am," said Corporal Grant, the young soldier who had coined the PowerPoint lady nickname, "I want to apologize for my behavior over the past months. I was completely wrong about you, and I'd like to learn from my mistake." Diana studied his face, seeing what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Corporal, the most important thing you can learn from this experience is that competence comes in many forms. Don't judge people by their current assignment, judge them by their willingness to share knowledge and help others improve." "Ma'am, would you be willing to include me in your new training program? I want to learn what real E8 expertise looks like." "I'd be happy to have you, Corporal. But I want you to understand that real expertise isn't about showing off or demonstrating superiority. It's about keeping people alive." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a military vehicle carrying personnel from the Pentagon. Diana recognized the insignia immediately. These were investigators from the Army's Explosive Ordnance Disposal Command, sent to assess the situation and determine how such a sophisticated device had ended up at Camp Ironwood. Colonel Pierce approached with 2 officers in tow, their uniforms bearing the kind of ribbons and badges that indicated extensive combat experience. "Torres, I'd like you to meet Colonel Sarah Martinez and Major Robert Chun from Pentagon EOD Command. They're here to investigate today's incident." Diana came to attention, recognizing that these officers would determine whether her actions had been appropriate and whether the base's security protocols needed to be updated. "Sir, ma'am, I'm prepared to provide whatever information you need about the device and the neutralization procedures." Colonel Martinez stepped forward with an expression of professional respect. "Staff Sergeant Caldwell, we've reviewed your service record and the preliminary reports about today's incident. Your handling of the situation was exemplary, and we'd like to discuss the possibility of incorporating your techniques into our standard training protocols. Diana felt a surge of pride that went beyond personal recognition. Her expertise would be used to train bomb disposal specialists across the military, potentially saving countless lives in future operations. Ma'am, I'd be honored to contribute to the development of updated training protocols. Additionally, Major Chen added, we'd like to discuss the possibility of your assignment to our advanced training facility. Your expertise would be invaluable in preparing EOD specialists for the sophisticated threats they're encountering in current operations. Diana looked around at the faces of the soldiers who had spent months dismissing her expertise, now realizing that they had been in the presence of someone whose knowledge was valued at the highest levels of military command. The PowerPoint lady they had mocked was about to become one of the most important instructors in the military's bomb disposal program. Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer, but I'd like to request permission to remain at Camp Ironwood for the immediate future. I believe I can make the greatest contribution by ensuring that the soldiers here receive the kind of training that will keep them alive in combat situations. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of response we expected from someone with your background. You'll have full support from Pentagon EOD Command for whatever training programs you develop. As the Pentagon officers departed to continue their investigation, Diana found herself standing in the same conference room where she had been dismissed and humiliated countless times over the past 18 months. But now the room felt different. It was no longer a place of professional exile, but the headquarters of a training program that would prepare soldiers for the real threats they would face. Sergeant Patel approached with a smile of genuine admiration. Ma'am, I think it's safe to say that the PowerPoint lady is officially dead and buried. Diana smiled back, feeling a profound sense of completion. Sergeant, I think you're right. Staff Sergeant Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, is finally ready to do what she came here to do. The transformation was complete, and Camp Ironwood would never underestimate the quiet ones again. 6 weeks after the incident that had transformed her from dismissed PowerPoint instructor to respected EOD expert, Diana stood in the newly constructed Advanced Explosive Ordnance Disposal Training Center, watching a group of soldiers practice the sophisticated techniques that could save their lives in real-world combat situations. The facility represented everything she had hoped to achieve when she first arrived at Camp Ironwood, a place where soldiers received expert training based on actual threats rather than outdated textbook procedures. The morning briefing room buzzed with focused energy as 30 soldiers from across the region gathered for what had become known as the Diffuser Protocol, a comprehensive training program that combined traditional EAD techniques with cutting-edge countermeasures designed to defeat sophisticated explosive devices. Diana had personally developed every aspect of the curriculum, drawing on her extensive combat experience and the latest intelligence reports about evolving threats. Good morning, Diana began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise rather than borrowed confidence. Today we're going to discuss pattern recognition in anti-tampering systems, and why the device that looks most familiar might actually be the most dangerous. Captain Lawson, now serving as her deputy instructor, nodded approvingly. His transformation had been as dramatic as Diana's own, from overconfident officer to humble student to skilled instructor who understood that real expertise required constant learning and respect for the complexity of modern threats. Ma'am, called out Sergeant Williams, a recent arrival from Fort Bragg, how do we balance the need for quick decision-making with the requirement for thorough analysis? Diana smiled, recognizing the kind of thoughtful question that indicated genuine engagement with the material. Sergeant, that's exactly the right question to ask. The answer lies in understanding that thorough analysis doesn't necessarily require extended time. It requires the right kind of preparation and pattern recognition. She clicked to her next slide, which showed a complex device similar to the one that had nearly killed Captain Lawson 6 weeks earlier. The device we're looking at incorporates multiple deception layers designed to make bomb disposal specialists think they understand what they're facing. The key to defeating it lies in recognizing the patterns that indicate sophisticated anti-tampering features. Private Emma Reeves, the young soldier who had once mocked Diana's expertise, raised her hand with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Ma'am, how do we develop the kind of pattern recognition that allows us to identify these deception layers?" Diana felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. These soldiers were asking the right questions, engaging with the material in ways that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than superficial memorization. Private pattern recognition comes from exposure to authentic examples and understanding the psychology of the people who build these devices. That's why we use real intelligence data in our training scenarios. The session continued for 2 hours, with Diana guiding her students through increasingly complex scenarios that required them to apply sophisticated analytical techniques under simulated pressure. The difference between this training and the inadequate programs that had been offered previously was profound. These soldiers were learning to think like bomb makers in order to defeat bomb makers. During the break, Diana found herself approached by Corporal Grant, the young soldier who had coined the PowerPoint lady nickname that had defined her existence for 18 months. His transformation had been particularly dramatic, from dismissive critic to dedicated student who understood that real expertise required humility and continuous learning. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this program," Grant said quietly. "I know I was wrong about you, and I'm grateful that you didn't let my previous behavior affect your willingness to teach me." Diana studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and determination. "Corporal, the most important thing you can learn from our past interactions is that everyone has something to teach, if you're willing to listen. Your job is to remain open to learning, regardless of where that knowledge comes from." "Ma'am, I've learned that lesson the hard way. I'll never again dismiss someone's expertise based on their current assignment or appearance." The afternoon session focused on practical exercises using sophisticated training devices that replicated the kind of threats soldiers would actually encounter in combat zones. Diana watched as her students applied the analytical techniques they had learned, their movements careful and deliberate rather than rushed and overconfident. "Ma'am," called out Staff Sergeant Torres, who had become one of her most dedicated students, "I'm seeing what appears to be a standard timer mechanism, but the wire configurations don't match the patterns we studied yesterday." Diana approached his position, pleased to see that he was applying the critical thinking skills that were essential for surviving encounters with sophisticated devices. "Sergeant, what does your analysis of the wire pattern suggest about the device's actual configuration?" "Ma'am, the inconsistency suggests that this device has been designed to appear conventional, while actually incorporating anti-tampering features." "Excellent analysis. What's your next step?" "Ma'am, I need to conduct a more thorough examination of the electronic components to identify the actual control systems." Diana nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Remember, the device that looks most familiar is often the most dangerous, because it's designed to exploit your assumptions about conventional procedures." As the training session concluded, Diana found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been dismissed as an incompetent civilian contractor whose expertise was irrelevant to modern military operations. Today, she was training soldiers who would deploy to combat zones with the kind of expert knowledge that could save their lives and the lives of their comrades. The transformation had been painful, requiring her to endure months of humiliation and professional dismissal. But it had also been necessary, teaching her valuable lessons about patience, perseverance, and the importance of maintaining professional standards even when others questioned her competence. "Ma'am," Sergeant Patel said, approaching with a folder. of evaluation reports. The feedback from today's session is outstanding. These soldiers are developing the kind of analytical skills that will serve them well in actual combat situations. Diana reviewed the reports, seeing evidence of genuine learning and professional growth. Sergeant, the most important thing is that they're learning to think critically about what they're seeing rather than simply following memorized procedures. Ma'am, that's exactly what makes your training program so effective. You're teaching them to understand the principles behind the techniques rather than just memorizing steps. As the students filed out of the training center, Diana felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal recognition. She had created something that would continue to save lives long after her own career ended, a training program that prepared soldiers for the real threats they would face rather than the theoretical scenarios that had dominated previous curricula. Evening, Diana sat in her newly assigned office, reviewing intelligence reports about emerging threats and updating training protocols to address evolving dangers. The work was challenging and demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. She was finally able to use her expertise to its fullest potential. A knock on her door interrupted her concentration. Colonel Pierce entered with an expression of genuine respect and gratitude. Torres, I wanted to personally thank you for what you've accomplished here. The training program you've developed is already being recognized as a model for installations across the military. Diana looked up from her reports, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and humility. Sir, I'm just grateful to finally be able to contribute my expertise in a meaningful way. Torres, I want you to know that I've learned valuable lessons from our interactions. I'll never again dismiss someone's expertise based on their current assignment or my own assumptions about their background. Sir, I think we've all learned valuable lessons from this experience. The important thing is that we use those lessons to create better training programs and more effective leadership practices. As Colonel Pierce left her office, Diana returned to her work, thinking about Marcus Webb and the promise she had made to ensure that other soldiers received the kind of expert training that could save their lives. Finally, she was honoring that promise in the most meaningful way possible by sharing her knowledge with soldiers who would carry that expertise into combat zones around the world. The PowerPoint lady was truly dead, replaced by Staff Sergeant Diana Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, the expert instructor she had always been meant to be. The quiet ones had finally shown everyone what real expertise looked like, and the lessons would echo through military training programs for years to come. 1 year after the incident that had transformed Camp Ironwood from a place of institutional mediocrity to a center of excellence in explosive ordnance disposal training, Diana stood before an audience of military leaders from across the country. The annual military training conference had invited her to deliver the keynote address about recognizing and developing expertise in unexpected places, and her presentation had drawn the largest audience in the conference's history. Ladies and gentlemen, Diana began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. I want to tell you about the most dangerous assumption in military leadership, the belief that competence is always visible, and that expertise announces itself through obvious credentials. The auditorium was packed with colonels, generals, and senior enlisted personnel who had come to hear from the woman whose unconventional journey from dismissed PowerPoint instructor to premier EOD expert had become legendary throughout the military. Diana's story had spread far beyond Camp Ironwood, becoming a case study in leadership schools and a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their current assignments. 18 months ago, I was known as the PowerPoint lady at a small training installation in Montana. I was dismissed, ignored, and treated as irrelevant by colleagues who judged my worth based on my current assignment rather than my potential contributions. Today, I stand before you as the director of the most advanced EOD training program in the military, responsible for preparing specialists who deploy to the most dangerous environments in the world. Diana clicked to her next slide, which showed a photograph of the explosive device that had nearly killed Captain Lawson and potentially hundreds of others. This device was neutralized not through superior technology or advanced equipment, but through expertise that had been hidden in plain sight for 18 months. The person who saved Camp Ironwood wasn't a highly credentialed specialist brought in from outside. It was someone who had been dismissed as incompetent by the very people whose lives she ultimately saved. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership, competence, and the recognition of expertise. Diana had refined her presentation over dozens of speaking engagements, but the core message remained unchanged. The people you overlook might be the ones with the most to teach you. The lessons from Camp Ironwood extend far beyond explosive ordnance disposal, Diana continued. They speak to a broader challenge in military leadership. Our tendency to judge people by their current position rather than their potential contributions. How many times do we dismiss valuable expertise because it doesn't come in the package we expect? She clicked to another slide showing statistics about military personnel who had been underutilized or dismissed before, making significant contributions in different roles. Research indicates that a significant percentage of military personnel possess skills and knowledge that exceed the requirements of their current assignments. These individuals represent untapped resources that could dramatically improve our operational effectiveness if we learn to recognize and develop their potential. Diana paused, thinking about her own journey from combat EOD specialist to dismissed instructor to respected expert. The transformation at Camp Ironwood didn't happen because someone brought in outside expertise. It happened because leadership finally recognized expertise that had been present all along. The question you need to ask yourselves is, how many PowerPoint ladies are serving in your units right now, waiting for someone to recognize their potential? The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, with Diana sharing specific examples of how Camp Ironwood had transformed its culture to value expertise over appearance, competence over credentials, and substance over style. She described the training programs that had emerged from her experience, the leadership development initiatives that had been implemented, and the measurable improvements in unit effectiveness that had resulted. The most important lesson from Camp Ironwood, Diana concluded, is that excellence often hides in unexpected places. The quiet ones aren't weak or incompetent. They're often the most skilled and experienced members of your organization. Your job as leaders is to create environments where that expertise can emerge and contribute to mission success. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting not just appreciation for Diana's presentation, but recognition of the broader implications of her message. During the question and answer session that followed, senior officers from across the military shared their own experiences with underutilized personnel and discussed strategies for better recognizing and developing hidden expertise. After the presentation, Diana found herself surrounded by officers who wanted to discuss implementing similar programs at their own installations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face, General Robert Morrison, the Pentagon observer who had recognized her expertise during that fateful shooting demonstration that felt like a lifetime ago. Staff Sergeant Caldwell, General Morrison said with a warm smile, "I wanted to personally congratulate you on what you've accomplished. The training program you've developed at Camp Ironwood is being used as a model for installations worldwide." Diana felt a surge of pride that went beyond personal recognition. "Sir, I'm grateful to have been able to contribute to the development of more effective training protocols. Additionally," Morrison continued, "I wanted to inform you that your techniques and training methods are being incorporated into the curriculum at the Army's Premier EAD School. Your expertise will be used to train the next generation of bomb disposal specialists." The implications were staggering. Diana's knowledge, which had been dismissed and ignored for 18 months, would now be used to train thousands of soldiers. who would deploy to combat zones around the world. The PowerPoint lady who had been mocked and marginalized would ultimately save more lives than she could have imagined. Later that evening, Diana sat in her hotel room reviewing emails from soldiers who had completed her training program and were now serving in combat zones. The messages were filled with gratitude and examples of how her training had prepared them for real-world threats that they might not have survived without proper preparation. One message particularly caught her attention. It was from Captain Lawson, now serving as an EOD instructor at Fort Bragg. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that I used the pattern recognition techniques you taught me to identify and neutralize a sophisticated device yesterday. The principles you shared probably saved my life and the lives of my team members. Thank you for seeing past my arrogance to teach me what real expertise looks like." Diana smiled, thinking about the young officer who had once dismissed her as an incompetent civilian contractor. His transformation had been as dramatic as her own, illustrating the power of humility and the importance of remaining open to learning from unexpected sources. She opened her laptop and began typing a response to the dozens of messages she had received from former students, colleagues, and military leaders who had been inspired by her story. But her mind kept returning to Marcus Webb, the partner she had lost in Afghanistan, and the promise she had made to ensure that other soldiers received the kind of expert training that could save their lives. "Marcus," she whispered to the empty room, "I think I've finally figured out how to honor your memory." The PowerPoint lady they had dismissed had become a legend, whose impact would ripple through military training programs for generations. The quiet ones had shown everyone what real strength looked like, and the lessons would never be forgotten. The transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. Across the military, leaders were learning to look beyond current assignments, to recognize hidden expertise, to value substance over style, and to remember that the people you overlook might be the ones with the most to teach you about excellence, perseverance, and the courage to keep fighting for what matters most. Diana Caldwell, call sign Diffuser, had finally found her place in the world. And the world was safer because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.